So in this video, we're going to look at the book of Esther. So let's think about our 8 questions. Who wrote the book of Esther? There's no internal or external evidence to prove who wrote it. Most people think that either Ezra wrote it or Mordecai wrote the book, but again, we're not sure. When we think about who it was written to the nation of Israel. When we think about how much time is covered, it was about 20 years. Now, chronologically, Esther fits into Ezra between chapter 6 and chapter 7. So it would be interesting if you read the book of Ezra, pause at when you finish chapter 6, read Esther, and then go back and pick up at chapter 7 of Ezra. So the main idea, it is an account of some events that happened to some Jews that did not return to Jerusalem, but stayed in Persia. And it's interesting to note that God's name is not mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. But we can see God's providence throughout the whole book. It's just filled with different things that God provided to work his will. So it's a real condensed version of providence is that God was going to provide without miracles, but just in everyday, mundane situations of life, he is going to work his will out. So Esther is just filled with those types of situations. When we think about the notable characters in the book of Esther, we see King Ahasuerus, Queen Vashti, Esther, and Mordecai. Now, Esther and Mordecai were cousins, and then you had Haman. Okay, so some notable events, and this is going to be quite lengthy because really Esther is just one long account. So, and again, I didn't include everything, but I tried to pick out the main things to understand the story. So it opens with King Ahasuerus having this banquet for all his officials and his servants. And it's a quite lengthy banquet, and they're really indulging in food and wine. And at one point, the queen demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, come, and the text says, show the people her beauty. So we're really not sure if he wanted her just to come in her clothes, or if he wanted her to come in naked. We're really not sure what it was, but whatever it was, she said, not going to do it. Whatever he wanted her to do, she just flat out refused to do it. Well, that makes the king irate. So he just sends her away. She's no longer queen anymore. And then when he kind of settles down after this outburst, his officials come to him, and this is what they ask him to do. So I'm just going to read directly from the text instead of try to summarize it. So this is Esther chapter 2. After these things, when the anger of the king had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under the custody of the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So they're going to gather this large harem of virgins, and the queen is going to be chosen from this group. Well, it ends up that Esther is part of this harem, and the text says that she was very beautiful. So about a year passes, and they provide them with all these cosmetics, and they kind of groom them to get ready. And the text says when it's their turn to go into the king. Well, that is language to let us know that it was for sex. They go in, each take turns going in and having sex with him. And then he's going to decide based on that which one he wants to choose to be the queen. So in chapter 2, we're going to start with, verse 16 for a summary. And it says, and when Esther was taken to the king into his royal palace in the 10th month, in the 12th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So we can see that Esther was chosen to be queen. So then we learned that Haman, now remember he's the bad guy in the story, he plots this plan to kill all the Jews. And it kind of really started with Mordecai because he just couldn't stand Mordecai, and he knew that Mordecai was a Jew. Nobody really knew that Esther was a Jew at this point because Mordecai had told her not to reveal that she was a Jew. But Haman just had this burning hatred inside of him for Mordecai, so he just thought, well, let's just get rid of all the Jews. So he kind of tricks the king into making this decree, and it's sealed with the king's royal signet ring. So that's kind of like a done deal. You can't reverse those type things. But Mordecai hears of it, and he's just distraught. He's in sackcloth and ashes, and he's just really upset. And Esther can see him through a window, and so she sends word to find out, what's wrong. So Mordecai sends word back to her, hey, this is what's going on. This is what's going to happen, and you need to step up and do something about it. And probably the most famous verse in all of Esther is taken from what Mordecai tells Esther. And he tells her, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So he's telling her, God has given you this opportunity to help the situation. What can you do? What are you going to do? So she decides that she's going to be really brave, and she's going to approach the king and discuss this with him. Now, in that time, it wasn't like happily married couple and they're together. She was apart from him most of the time, and she was only able to come into his presence when he summoned her. So if she approached the throne without being summoned, he had the right to kill her. So she says, well, if I die, I die. I'm going to go. So she summons strength, summons courage, and approaches the throne. But thankfully, the king does not kill her, and he wants to know, hey, what's going on? What's your request? So she's like, well, I'm going to give a banquet for you and Haman, and we'll talk more then. So they have a banquet, and she doesn't mention it the first time. She says, well, let's have a second banquet. So at the second banquet is when she reveals to the king that Haman had this evil plan to exterminate all the Jews, and that she was a Jew. Well, the king is just furious with Haman, so he hangs him on some gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. Well, remember, the decree was sealed with a signet ring, so he couldn't change the law. But what they did instead was told the Jews the date that it was going to happen and let them fight back. And they were able to fight back and totally destroy the enemy. And they were just so glad about this, they determined that they would always have a holiday each year to remember the time that they were able to fight back and defeat their enemies. And it's called Feast of Purim. And you'll see this on modern day calendars today. It usually falls toward the end of February. So this is still something that Jews today think about and remember, because it was a big deal for them to be able to fight back and defeat the enemy. So when we think about where on the timeline, it falls in that section called Return to Jerusalem, even though these people weren't in Jerusalem, and the account's not taking place in Jerusalem. It's taking place in Persia, but still it falls into that time frame. When we think about Jesus, again, God's not mentioned. There's no prophecies mentioned, but it is a big deal because it preserves that earthly seed line. So remember that promise that was made to David about through his descendants was going to come, someone that was going to establish a kingdom, and he was speaking of Jesus. And even before that, Abraham, through Abraham's seed, all the earth would be blessed. So really in the balance here is those promises that God had made earlier in the Old Testament to bring Jesus into the world. So when we think about why to study the book of Esther, to me, the main thing is providence, just reading it and looking for times that God just used everyday events to work his will. And really the one that stands out to me is you've got Esther, who was an orphan. Both her mother and father had died. She's being raised by a cousin in a foreign country, but God was able to use that. He was able to take her and put her at the right place at the right time, and just all these things fell into place. And they weren't fun things, really. I mean, she's part of a harem if you think about it. So it wasn't necessarily easy, but she made the choice that she was going to do the right thing and be brave, and God was able to use that. So we can always be confident of God's care and protection no matter what's going on. Just like in the life of Esther, she's an orphan. She's in a foreign country. She's been taken and placed in this harem. But she was able to figure out what she could do for God and move forward. So no matter what our situation is, where we find ourselves, we can take courage knowing that God can and will work through our lives using his providence. We just have to look around and look for opportunities and be brave enough to act upon them. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope it shed a little bit of light on the book of Esther. I keep saying Esther, and tackle it. It's again, it's a short read. You can read it in one setting, and look for those things that you might consider providence. Again, it's not inspired. It's not like, well, this is definitely providence and this is not. So just kind of read it yourself and see if you can determine what you think may be providence of God bringing about his will to, say, the Jews. So this concludes the history of the Jews in the Old Testament. And the next section of scripture is what's considered poetry or wisdom literature. And we will start that with the next video.